right, so now we're going to hear from David.
Nice.
Okay, good afternoon. This is that coveted 20 minutes after lunch in the digesting spot. Hopefully I can get a couple points across. So I was asked to talk about progress in terms of smallholder mapping of area and yields. Just to be really clear, this is not in the early warning mode of operation at all. This is really about the food security part of this panel, trying to get a better understanding of the conditions in food insecure regions of the world, which traditionally has been very hard, but is becoming increasingly easy. Now, in thinking about what to say about progress in the few minutes I have, I find that it's a very subtle but maybe very frequently misunderstood point for people who are kind of consumers of this information, is that measuring progress is actually not so straightforward. Measuring performance of methods is really not straightforward in the complex smaller systems that don't traditionally have very strong ground data. Ground data has come up a lot yesterday, increasingly today. So I want to start by making that point, if you'll go to the next slide. Don't misunderstand me. Ground data is very critical for developing models, and it's also critical for evaluating models. But looking at how well satellite products or satellite estimates agree with ground data, or ground truth as we often call it, can be very misleading. It could be misleading in terms of looking too good, and it can also be misleading in terms of looking too bad. Traditionally, we think of it in terms of looking too good. Like if you see somebody stand up and show you a plot where everything is on a one-to-one line, you should immediately be suspicious that they're showing you the data that they trained on, right? This is something hopefully most of you know, is that if you're looking at the performance on the data you use to develop your model, that's not a very good test for your model. That's the typical kind of thing we worry about. But there's the flip side, if you will go on, which is partly reinforced out of this collaboration we've had with the LSMS team at the World Bank in Uganda. So similar geography, same geography as we were just talking about. So let me just briefly describe this study. It's led by, again, the LSMS team working with UBAS in Uganda. And the idea was to develop an understanding of the best ways of measuring maize yields in eastern Uganda. So there's three ground truths that we collected. All three have been done, but the first two are the most common. On the left is a self-report. You go and interview a farmer. Where's your plot? How big is it? How much production did you have? That's standard. Crop cutting, as shown in the middle here, you lay out a plot. In this case, it was fairly big by the standards of this typical type of work. It's 8 by 8 meters, and we then harvest everything inside that 8 by 8 meter, and that's our estimate, our objective estimate of yield. And then on the right is what we call full plot harvest, which is what it sounds like. You actually harvest the entire plot with the farmer. There was a great team that UBAS put together to be ready to go when the farmers were ready to go. And you weigh the grain after it's dried, so you have a very, very accurate, but this is, as you can imagine, hugely expensive way of actually getting estimates of yield. And just to be clear here, we're talking about field-level estimates of yields, not just sort of what's going on at the district level, but trying to drill down in these smaller systems in the way we can, say, in the U.S., to understand at the field level what's going on. So the first point to make here is that these ground measures don't actually agree with each other. And this is something that surprises people who haven't maybe been working in these regions. On the left is showing you the self-report versus the crop cut yield with the an R-squared of 0, which for those of you not used to this is not a very good R-squared. And then on the right is showing you the full plot harvest on the y-axis here against these crop cut. And even though these are two objective measures and there's not necessarily any measurement error per se going on, the fact that these fields are so heterogeneous means that if you take an 8 by 8 meter subplot, even in a smaller field, 8 by 8 meters is at most a few percent of the area of the field. And that heterogeneity leads to an R-squared of something like 0.26. Now what we did was we had Sentinel-2 data throughout the season. Luckily we got a few clear images, and we developed estimates based on those satellites. And here I'm showing you two different estimates, and I have a question here, a little post-lunch quiz for you. Which of these models is better? On the left, we have the model that's been developed using the full plot fields, and on the right, we have the model that's been developed using the crop cut. So how many, show of hands, how many of you think the model on the left is better? And how many many of you think the model on the right is better? And how many think I haven't given you enough information to tell you? Okay, good. So the fact is that these models actually were almost identical in terms of what they ended up predicting for a field. That if you think of it as simple linear regression, the slopes and the offsets were all similar. It's just that this looks worse because there's a whole bunch more noise, in a sense, in the ground data. So if we look at, go forward one more slide, if we look at the comparing against the real truth, which is these full plot harvests, if we look at the errors in our estimates as a function of how many fields we've gone to, and we went to many more fields than this, but this just shows kind of where most of the action is. Even if you're training off of those sort of poor ground fields, and our training R-squares don't look that good, if you actually compare it to the full plot yields, you do quite well with those crop cuts or with the full plot harvest. It turns out the self-reports are so bad that even using a lot of them doesn't really help in terms of developing a good model. So this is just to give you a sense as we think about, okay, when are these methods ready for prime time? Say, when do they really start to achieve the levels of accuracies that consumers want, whether it's, there's all sorts of users and customers here. It's important to really not, I would say, privilege too much the sort of existing data sources that we're using, because they're often not very good. Now, the second thing I'll say, in sort of the spirit of being provocative on the panel, is if you're asking the question of when will we be able to map yield in smaller systems in some of the most complex landscapes in the world, I'll say now. I think we can already do it. I think the Sentinel-2, I know this is a NASA meeting, and I think NASA assets have been quite helpful, but what's really transformed the space in the last couple of years, in my view, has been the European Space Agency, so I don't usually give a shout out to the Europeans in the room, but there you go. That combined with Planet, you're welcome. Planet has been a little bit helpful. I don't want to discount the private sector providers. NASA, I mean, it's an old ecosystem we talked about, we don't need to single out, but just to give special credit to the Sentinel satellites, they've really transformed the ability to see a lot of these parts of the world. And so what's really critical, though, is you don't have ground data, not even bad ground data, you don't have any ground data in most parts of the world. So what we've tried hard in my group to do is think about how do you get estimates where you don't have ground data, because that's the basis for saying that we can do it now, is that we can do it in a way that doesn't rely on ground data. Of course, we still want to be able to use ground data where it exists, but it doesn't always exist. So what we do instead is we rely a lot on our experience with crop simulation models as a community to help interpret the imagery. And there's been variations of this type of method out there, but this is a particular one that we've developed that's quite rapid to implement. So if you go to the next plot, this shows you now Eastern Africa, 2 countries that we've done systematic evaluations across Kenya and Tanzania. On the right is showing you working with 1 Acre Fund, which is an NGO in the region, and their crop cuts in different districts, what their district average is for those crop cuts. Again, not a perfect estimate of yield, but they typically have a dozen or more crop cuts in a district versus what we've estimated, and that shows you the agreement there. And then this just gives you an example of the types of heterogeneity. So now we're actually, part of the goal of this startup I mentioned, this public benefit corporation, is to take estimates like this, and there are other non-agriculture related outcomes that the company is also interested in. But to take the methods and the data streams that are available and to try to, in near real time, create data sets that are useful for all sorts of users. And this can go over time. So this is showing you a map of 2016 for the whole region. That's not going to work because I took a screenshot, but it would work in that. And we do plan to make a bunch of these data sets public, probably with some sort of time lag to protect some sort of, we were talking about sustainable business models in the last panel, we have to figure that out. If you go to the next one, you just get a sense of if you really zoom in, this is part of Western Kenya, give you a sense of the type of heterogeneity you can capture now. These are mainly based on Sentinel 1 and 2. And again, you can look over time and start to use this to do science, to do different decision making at the governmental level, at the corporate level, at the NGO level. So I think it's a very exciting time, to both in terms of where the algorithms have gotten, where the methods have gotten, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the time. Thanks.
Thank you, David. So next we hear from Tim from the Lutheran Moderator.
Thank you. Catherine and the Harvest team, thank you guys really a lot for including LWR. We are thrilled to be a part of the consortium, and we're thrilled to be a part of today. Thank you also for including the NGO perspective in the room today. I'm feeling a little vulnerable because I think we're actually one of the few NGOs in a room full of scientists. And to be honest, that means I understood about 30% of what you just said. Right? A couple of takeaways before I start. One is that even though there are a lot of different types of institutions in the room, I'm hearing the same end goal from everybody. That we're looking for more stable and functioning markets, we're looking for more sustainable use of the planet's resources, and we're looking for greater food security. What I was struck by was that there are lots of different entry points. And I think that as a development NGO, we offer a somewhat unique entry point into this dialogue. So I think that while there are many, many different types of bedfellows in the room today, and while a faith-based NGO may be among the most unlikely bedfellows, I really think that blending the perspective of the science community, the government, the private sector, and the NGO community can actually make for really powerful allies as the consortium moves forward. I want to do a couple of quick things today. I want to talk briefly about what we've been doing with NASAHarvest at the University of Maryland and how it's worked. I want to quickly describe some of the benefits that we're beginning to see from the pilot work and what we think some of the durable impacts may be. And then finally, I was asked to kind of offer, again, from the perspective of an NGO, a few comments and opportunities about how we see EO being utilized in the development space and some of the greater applications that we think it might have. So very quickly, just a quick word about Lutheran World Relief. We are an international faith-based NGO approaching 75 years in our history. And for much of that time, the dominant focus of our development work has been working in rural communities with the hypothesis that catalyzing agricultural investment in rural communities is the best way to drive poverty reduction and achieve development outcomes. One of the more exciting things in the last year for LWR is that we've just merged with another faith-based group called IMA World Health. So if you hear me talking about LWR IMA, I'm still getting used to our new title. But by combining a group like LWR with our focus on rural livelihoods and a group like IMA, whose focus is on health system strengthening, we really bring, I think, the possibility of achieving greater impact in the communities where we work. As you can see, we're operational in about 23 different countries with remote operations in another 12 or so, depending upon what's going on. One of the tenets about our work that I think is really important when we talk about the sustainability of what this consortium is trying to do is that LWR and IMA believe firmly and deeply that working through local partners is the right way to achieve the durable outcomes and to address the inevitable power dynamics, and someone used the phrase today, information asymmetrics that exist in our work. And so in almost every case where we work, LWI and IMA rely extensively and almost exclusively on local networks of farmer organizations, producer groups, local NGOs, local churches, and local governments to get our work done. So I was also asked to try to tackle the question as the lone NGO rep in the room, why are NGOs interested in Earth observation data? And I come back to something that Imbal said in her opening. That part of what NASAHarvest is trying to do as a consortium is to break down the silos. Right? And I think that's a really important evolution. That when I started working in this field maybe 20, 25 years ago, you had multiple silos all in the development space. Government silos, UN silos, private sector silos, NGO sector silos. None of them talked to each other in an efficient way, and we were not taking advantage of each other's capacities and expertise and value add. So I think that when I talk to my peers in the NGO community, more and more of us are recognizing that the value add of the scientific community and the research committee that is working on remote sensing and working on EO adds a huge opportunity that when you blend it with the perspective of most NGOs who start from the community and work our way up to systems, and you combine it with remote sensing work that starts at the systems level, you can achieve a much greater impact. Closing that information gap that farmers are vulnerable to is a key aspect. Right? It's about how to get it, how to analyze it, and how to use it to make better informed decisions. And most importantly, how to get it into the hands of the farmers in the right time and with the right translation to help them make the decisions they need, which affect their livelihoods, their income, and their resilience. This is especially true in many places where we work, where hard to access areas, either because of conflict or lack of budget or lack of resources, make government services extremely limited or inefficient. So closing that information gap, I think, is a key reason why many NGOs like LWR and IMA are looking to engage with the University of Maryland in the Harvest Consortium. Real-time crop condition monitoring, weather monitoring, groundwater sensing is critical not just for governments as they plan their preparedness and response systems, but for NGOs like us who work with small producers on the ground. Again, it's about getting them access to the data that they can use to guide their own decisions. It's not just the top-down perspective that EO provides, but it's the combination of top-down and bottom-up that to us strikes us as full of potential and a pretty potent combination as we move forward. When you combine the top-down and the bottom-up dual data platform, you give all stakeholders a much richer, more nuanced, and more segmented view of what's happening locally and what needs to be done locally. Right? This type of dual data platform is especially critical in lots and lots of rural economies where we work, and David mentioned it, where you go into a plot, right? Intercropping is the norm. Farmers are typically growing 5-6 crops for cash, for income, and for consumption. Right? Pests and disease can be very local. Reactions to weather patterns among coffee crops can be very local. And communications and interface between government mechanisms and community perspectives are either weak or non-existent. So what we're beginning to see from some work we've done a little bit in Uganda, a little bit in Tanzania, and now just starting in Mali with NASAHarvest, is that this dual platform data can actually have a dual level impact. From a systems perspective, we can see it beginning to shape better and more effective early warning and preparedness response. I think that the gentleman from Uganda, his presentation, showed the impact and the efficacy of their federal response mechanisms as a result of the work. But equally importantly, at the community and at the household level, which gets right back to LWR's mission, right? We know from resilience measurement initiatives in places like South Asia that farmers who have access to early warning data clearly show adapted and strengthened resilience capacities in ways that farmers that don't have access to that early warning can't possibly achieve. So that dual level impact is a critical piece. Very quickly, we began working with the University of Maryland back in 2016 in Uganda and Tanzania through the UMD AgriSense STARS project. And one of the things we really wanted to explore was how do we take the network of extension agents that LWR had already equipped with smartphone infrastructure and adding additional data collection information from them that could be combined with what the EO data was producing and being filtered into those monthly bulletins that Catherine talked about. Those bulletins, next, when you combine them, are a pretty powerful instrument. And I'll give you an example of how we saw it playing out. What we saw in one snapshot of time was extension agents being able to relay information from farmers about very localized flooding and heavy sporadic rains in some areas that the EO data itself wasn't capturing. Right? That data went from the farmers up to the government and then very quickly came back down in the form of recommendations about how to replace lost nutrients in the soil that were affected by the flooding and how to employ greater and better agroforestry techniques to reduce leaching if those heavy rains continue. So the information gap is closing. Not perfect, but it's much better. getting that more efficient round-trip data is going to be a key challenge. Next. Moving on, we took the experience from East Africa and began to think about how to apply it elsewhere. And in conversations with Catherine and her team, recognized that partly through a grant that we had received from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, an opportunity to extend this into central Mali provided a really interesting place to do it, in part because Mali's political and security environment was so much different. So early this spring, we launched the third kind of pilot exercise to see again how we could take field-based work that we were doing with farmers to improve their resilience and combine it with EO-driven work that the University of Maryland and Harvest could do to improve government preparedness and planning systems. We just launched it, and in the spring we had a series of planning and assessment meetings working with groups like FuseNet, the Government Early Warning System, or SAP, in order to begin mapping it out. And next month, we'll begin training both the field agents that we've got as part of our network, as well as the government entities to put these two together. So while we're just starting it, we really see huge potential. I want to very, very quickly end with 3 comments that I kind of would like to throw out into the room. I think that the issue of sustainability and cost and coordination of this field-level data collection is a considerable challenge. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, and I think there are a number of ways that we as a community can think about alternative ways of getting that ground data more built into the system. Secondly, and this one I think is the most important, we saw in Uganda that when farmers were giving the information back up to the government, and the government was responding, the farmers were in effect saying, it's the first time the farmer voice has been heard. That's really different, right? And I think that we can use that as a huge opportunity in places like Mali, where the security is terrible and getting worse, as a way to build trust and social capital between governments and communities who are oftentimes left out, forgotten, and feeling ignored. Getting governments the information they need to make the right recommendations and getting that information to farmers in a way that makes sense for them can be a huge way of thinking about the application of EO in a fragile state environment. So I'm over time there. I apologize, but I will stop and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Tim. And next we hear from Tim Verdin.
So my thanks to the organizers for this opportunity to share with you what I consider to be a kind of success story from the perspective of the Family Early Warning Systems Network. And that has to do with the establishment of the crop monitor for early warning, which we heard a little bit about this morning from INBOW. I'm going to talk a little bit about our motivation to get involved in getting it stood up and our motivation and benefits that accrue to us by staying with it on a month-to-month basis. So our motivation really stems from an early warning perspective where we recognize that early warning is most important because it supports decision-making that can mitigate acute food insecurity and human suffering. And we understand that the decision-makers who are informed by early warning are challenged by ambiguity and reticent to commit large amounts of resources to a problem unless they really feel like the evidence is compelling. And so good early warning brings together the very best of data and experience and expert judgment to reduce as much as possible the ambiguity surrounding the situation so that a decision maker feels confident going ahead and making that commitment. A collaborative process can be part of that effective early warning because it brings together resources from multiple organizations, share data, shared information, shared networks, and experiences that various organizations have on the ground. It also is a way in which to achieve regular communication among groups and individuals that have common goals and objectives, and along the way, develop common definitions and criteria for classification of crop growing conditions that enhance everyone's understanding and, again, contributes to this reduction in ambiguity. It's a deliberative process that's grown up that reconciles different perspectives and builds consensus. And consensus is an attribute of information that appeals to decision makers who are consumers of that information. So the opportunity to set up a crop monitor for early warning was created thanks to the existence of the GeoGlam initiative that was initiated by the 20. And really that first crop monitor that looked at the big producing countries of the world showed the way in which a collaborative process could lead to a higher quality information set than individual organizations working alone. Each organization that comes together has its own strengths and weaknesses in terms of its assets, whether they're remote sensing, people on the ground who know what's going on, networks of observational instruments on the ground, etc. So the goal then, when we set out for this, was to achieve, to sustainably share crop condition assessments through a joint production of an international crop condition bulletin for the countries at risk of food security not covered by the original crop monitor, which covered the big producing countries of the world. And the network, as it began, was NASA UMD, the European Joint Research Center, FAO, WFP, FuseNet, and has continued to grow. Rice, national entities from South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda are participants, regional organizations like APAC and East Africa, and there are probably some more recent joiners that I forgot or didn't put on the slide. So it's very encouraging that the community grows, and because the collaborative process gets that much richer as a consequence. So some key events in the timeline to realize this activity go back to 2014, 2015, where in meetings not unlike this one, that brought together people with shared interests in the application of Earth observations to monitoring agriculture to support early warning, came together and started discussing, well, how could we do this? Why don't we put together a crop monitor for early warning? And that led to some prototyping. And by February of 2016, the methods and approach were mature enough that publication began, and it's been continuous ever since then. It's one wherein there's a shared platform with many different data and information products from remote sensing or related modeling that are shared among the participants, but very importantly, a platform whereby the analysts who are judging and classifying crop growing conditions every month can upload their classifications where they're shared and consolidated in order to reveal consensus where there's more than one evaluation or classification for a place, or discrepancies. And it's the resolution of these discrepancies that's a real hallmark of the crop monitor for early warning, because it's done in a very collaborative and congenial way, wherein the University of Maryland team produces discrepancy maps that show where there are differences of opinion regarding the condition of the crops that are currently growing, and identifies the sources of the different classifications so that in the course of the web conference, people can explain what the evidence is that backs up their particular crop condition classification, talk it through, put greater weight on ground reports as opposed to maybe one remote sensing piece of evidence along. So it's really matured. It runs rather smoothly now. There's a real constituency for this. There's a listserv with thousands of subscribers and a lot of readers of the bulletins online. And we see the products being picked up very often and incorporated into various kinds of online reports produced by third parties. So here's an example quickly of one of those discrepancy maps. This is for maize growing season in East Africa. And you can see the very simple crop condition classification system, the legend there on the left, in just primary colors. And then those regions where there are differing classifications that they resolve in the hatching. And the sources of those different classifications identified on the right. And in the corner, some context showing the stage of the crop calendar for the crop in question. And so, place by place, these are taken up and discussed and resolved through a call that has really grown to be very rich in terms of the kind of information and evidence that's brought to bear, and the working relationships that have formed among people with shared interests who maybe wouldn't ever have met each other otherwise. So in FuseNet, of course, our first constituency for our early warnings is the Office of Food for Peace at USAID. What we see very often is that the crop monitor for early warning maps and pie charts are incorporated into the monthly food assistance outlook briefings that are provided to Food for Peace officers who have the responsibility for making commitments of very large amounts of money and in-kind food assistance all around the world on a month-to-month basis. We also see the maps being incorporated in special bulletins and alerts like the one that you see on the right. And just for a little context, it's early warning information of this time that led to 2018 guidance for allocation of food for peace resources valued at $3.7 billion, 2.5 million metric tons of grain, reaching 76 million people in 59 countries around the world. So we're very grateful that we have this new source of information and professional consensus to help with that family function. I was going to tell you what the elements of success are. That will keep it going. Very quickly, all these groups are producing crop condition information on their own anyway. And so the benefit of doing that little bit of extra work to contribute to this process every month is not very great, and it's much smaller than the value that's accrued to the participants than the cost. So in the end, then, these consensus assessments in a really appealing format are there to be taken up and to enhance the credibility of reporting by